There are moments in history when legends collide, not in hatred, but in the pursuit of truth. Bruce Lee stood in that dojo in 1968, watching Chuck Norris move through kata with a precision that seemed almost lazy. Too relaxed, too comfortable. Bruce had conquered every opponent who'd crossed his path, each one falling before his lightning speed and revolutionary philosophy. But this American fighter, this karate champion everyone whispered about, looked soft around the edges. Bruce saw the easy smile, the humble demeanor, the way Chuck stepped aside to let others demonstrate first. He saw what looked like weakness. What Bruce Lee didn't see, what he couldn't possibly know in that moment, was that he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his career. Not about fighting, not about technique, but about the dangerous gap between what strength looks like and what strength actually is. Some lessons can only be taught one way, and Chuck Norris was about to become Bruce Lee's greatest teacher. The heat in Los Angeles that summer felt thick enough to slice. Bruce Lee had been in America for 4 years now, building something the martial arts world had never seen. His reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Across dojos and tournaments, fighters spoke his name with equal parts reverence and fear. He'd challenged the traditional ways, broken down the rigid structures of classical kung fu, and created something fluid, something alive. Jeet Kune Do wasn't just a fighting style. It was philosophy made flesh, adapting to every opponent, flowing like water, striking like a bullet. Bruce carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd earned every ounce of respect he commanded. At 5'7" and 135 pounds, he'd proven that size meant nothing against speed, nothing against precision, nothing against the kind of obsessive dedication that turned a human body into a weapon. He trained 6 hours a day, sometimes 8. He studied physics and anatomy. He pushed his body past every limit, and then found new ones to break. When Bruce Lee entered a room, you felt it in your chest before you saw him. That's why the invitation felt strange. A friend had suggested Bruce visit this particular dojo in Torrance, a place where a relatively unknown fighter was teaching. Chuck Norris. The name came with whispers. Multiple championship titles in karate, they said. Undefeated in competition. A military veteran who'd learned to fight in Korea. Bruce had heard these things before about other fighters, and each time the reality disappointed. Champions of traditional systems, impressive in their limited context, but lacking the revolutionary understanding Bruce had achieved. Still, curiosity pulled him forward. He wanted to see what everyone was talking about. The dojo felt modest when Bruce stepped inside. Clean wooden floors, white walls, the smell of canvas and sweat. Nothing fancy. Nothing that screamed greatness. About 20 students worked through drills, their movements crisp but traditional. Classical karate. Bruce watched with an analytical eye, cataloging their techniques, noting the gaps in their guard, the telegraph movements, the reliance on forms over function. Then he saw Chuck. The first thing Bruce noticed was the size. Chuck Norris stood nearly 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who'd been forged rather than born. But it wasn't the size that caught Bruce's attention. It was the ease. Chuck moved through his kata with a relaxed precision that looked almost casual. His strikes flowed smoothly, his stances shifted without effort, and his face held an expression of calm contentment. He looked like someone enjoying a light workout, not a legendary champion. Bruce watched him interact with students between drills, offering corrections with gentle voice, demonstrating techniques with patient repetition, laughing at someone's joke. Bruce felt something tighten in his chest. This was the great Chuck Norris? This friendly, soft-spoken instructor who looked more like a neighborhood coach than a warrior? Where was the intensity? Where was the fire? Bruce had expected to see someone hungry, someone sharp, someone who carried their reputation like a blade. Instead, he saw someone who looked comfortable, maybe too comfortable. Someone who'd clearly won their titles and then settled into teaching, their edge dulled by time and complacency. Chuck noticed Bruce watching and walked over, his smile genuine and warm. "You must be Bruce Lee. I've heard incredible things about your work. It's an honor to have you here." His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his demeanor welcoming without a trace of posturing. Bruce shook his hand and felt the calluses, the signs of years of training, but still that nagging doubt remained. Great fighters didn't smile like this. Great fighters didn't carry themselves with this kind of easy humility. They were hungry, intense, always proving themselves. "I've heard about you too," Bruce said, measuring his words carefully. "Your tournament record is impressive." It was a compliment with distance built in, polite, but non-committal. Bruce had learned to read fighters through their energy, and Chuck's energy felt too settled, too content. When you reached the top, you either stayed sharp or you softened. Bruce suspected Chuck had softened. They talked for a while, discussing philosophy and technique. Chuck spoke about respect for all martial arts traditions, about the importance of continuous learning, about staying humble. All good things, Bruce thought, but perhaps revealing. Maybe Chuck had peaked early. Maybe those tournament victories came when the competition was weaker, when traditional karate was enough. Bruce had revolutionized combat. He'd taken from every style, tested everything through sparring and street fights, eliminated what didn't work. He'd transcended tradition while Chuck seemed married to it. When Chuck invited Bruce to train together sometime, Bruce accepted with reserved enthusiasm. Part of him was curious. Part of him wanted to confirm his suspicions. And part of him, the part that drove him to challenge every assumption, needed to see Chuck under pressure. You never really knew a fighter until you felt their technique directed at you. Over the next few weeks, that initial impression calcified into certainty. Bruce visited the dojo 3 more times, each visit reinforcing his conclusion. Chuck was talented, no question. His technique was clean, his understanding solid. But Bruce saw the limits. Chuck remained bound by traditional karate structures, the rigid stances, the formal kata, the emphasis on tournament rules. He'd mastered a specific game, Bruce thought, but the game itself was limited. Bruce watched Chuck spar with his students and saw the control, the way Chuck pulled his strikes, the way he let students work through problems rather than overwhelming them. Teaching methods, Bruce understood, but also signs of someone who'd stopped pushing themselves. Great fighters never stopped pushing. They were always testing, always challenging, always looking for the next level. Chuck looked like someone who'd found his level and built a home there. Bruce shared his observations with some of his own students. "He's good," Bruce said, choosing his words carefully. "Very technical, strong fundamentals. But I think his reputation might exceed his current abilities. Tournament success in traditional karate doesn't necessarily translate to real combat effectiveness." His students listened, trusting Bruce's judgment. After all, Bruce had never been wrong about a fighter before. The doubt grew quietly but steadily. When people mentioned Chuck's name, Bruce offered qualified praise. When someone suggested Chuck might be one of the best, Bruce smiled and said, "In his style, perhaps." He never attacked Chuck directly. That wasn't Bruce's way. But he also didn't offend Chuck when others questioned him. The martial arts community picked up on these subtle signals. If Bruce Lee had reservations about Chucknorris, those reservations mattered. What Bruce couldn't see was a depth beneath Chuck's surface. He couldn't see the hours Chuck spent training when the dojo closed, pushing his body through conditioning routines that would break most men. He couldn't see the notebooks where Chuck analyzed every sparring session, every competition, constantly refining his understanding. He couldn't see the way Chuck had integrated techniques from multiple styles into his karate, quietly revolutionizing it from within while respecting its traditions. And he definitely couldn't see the restraint Chuck practiced every day, the conscious choice to be gentle with students while maintaining the ability to be devastating with peers. Bruce saw comfort where there was actually confidence. He saw softness where there was actually strength that didn't need to announce itself. He saw limitation where there was actually mastery, so complete it looked effortless. The problem with being as brilliant as Bruce Lee was that sometimes your confidence in your own judgment became its own blind spot. The moment arrived on an autumn afternoon when the air in Los Angeles had finally cooled. Bruce had been invited to demonstrate his art at a martial arts expo, a gathering of different styles and schools. He accepted, always eager to share Jeet Kune Do with new audiences. When he arrived and saw Chuck's name on the demonstration roster, something tightened in his chest. They'd be performing on the same stage, their contrasting approaches on display. This felt like an opportunity, though Bruce wasn't entirely sure for what. Backstage, the energy crackled with nervous excitement. Fighters from different disciplines prepared their demonstrations, stretching, reviewing their routines, psyching themselves up. Bruce found Chuck in a quiet corner, sitting calmly, breathing slowly, his eyes closed, not nervously pacing, not shadowboxing, just sitting. The image reinforced everything Bruce believed. A fighter about to demonstrate in front of hundreds of martial artists should have that pre-performance intensity, that edge. Chuck looked like someone waiting for a bus. When Chuck opened his eyes and saw Bruce, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "Bruce, good to see you. Are you demonstrating today?" The friendliness felt almost naive. They were both about to be judged by their peers, compared and evaluated, and Chuck acted like they were meeting for coffee. "I am," Bruce said. "Should be interesting to see different approaches on the same stage." He kept his tone neutral, but underneath, his competitive fire burned. He wanted the audience to see the difference, to understand why his way represented evolution, while traditional methods represented stagnation. Chuck nodded thoughtfully. "I'm looking forward to seeing your demonstration. Your understanding of combat dynamics is remarkable." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no hint of rivalry, just sincere appreciation. Bruce found it almost frustrating. Where was the fighter's pride? Where was the competitive spirit? Bruce's demonstration came first. He stepped onto stage with controlled intensity, his presence immediately commanding every eye in the room. For 20 minutes, he displayed the principles of Jeet Kune Do, lightning-fast strikes from unconventional angles, fluid transitions between ranges, techniques borrowed and refined from boxing, fencing, Wing Chun, wrestling. His partner, a skilled student, tried to attack with different methods, and Bruce dismantled each approach with clinical precision. The audience watched in stunned silence, broken only by occasional gasps when Bruce's speed defied belief. When he finished, the applause thundered through the venue. Bruce stood there, feeling the validation, the recognition. This was the power of revolutionary thinking. This was what happened when you transcended tradition and found truth. He bowed and stepped off stage, his heart racing with satisfaction. Then Chuck's demonstration began. Bruce watched from the wings, his critical eye ready to catalog the limitations he expected to see. Chuck stepped onto the stage with that same calm energy, acknowledged the audience with a respectful bow, and began. His demonstration partner was another karate black belt, someone who could handle full contact pressure. For the first few minutes, Bruce saw what he expected. Clean karate technique, powerful but traditional strikes, good form. Impressive for what it was, but nothing revolutionary. The audience appreciated it, but Bruce could feel they weren't as electrified as they'd been during his demonstration. Then something changed. Chuck shifted gears. The traditional kata gave way to sparring, and suddenly the easy comfort vanished, replaced by something else entirely. Chuck's partner attacked with full commitment, and Chuck's response was like watching lightning take human form. His speed rivaled Bruce's own. His strikes landed with concussive force that echoed through the venue. But more than that, more than Bruce expected, Chuck displayed adaptability. When his partner tried boxing combinations, Chuck countered with boxing. When he tried grappling, Chuck's wrestling appeared. When he used kicks, Chuck's timing and distance control were perfect. Bruce felt his certainty waver. This wasn't the fighter he'd watched in that dojo. This wasn't the comfortable instructor going through the motions. This was something else entirely. Chuck moved between techniques and ranges as fluidly as Bruce himself did. The traditionalist exterior had hidden a progressive interior. Every principle Bruce had thought Chuck didn't understand, Chuck was demonstrating with devastating effectiveness. The sparring escalated. Chuck's partner came harder, clearly tried to test him, maybe even land something clean. Chuck responded with combinations that Bruce recognized from his own training. A Wing Chun trap, followed by Western boxing. A judo sweep into a karate strike. The synthesis wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Chuck had done exactly what Bruce had done. He'd just done it quietly, without announcing it, without needing credit for the revolution. Then Chuck did something that stopped Bruce's breath. His partner shot in for a wrestling takedown, and Chuck defended with a technique Bruce had only developed recently, a counterbalancing method Bruce thought was uniquely his. But there it was, executed perfectly by Chucknorris, which meant either Chuck had figured out independently, or more troubling, Chuck's understanding of combat physics was sophisticated enough to develop the same solutions Bruce had found. The demonstration ended with Chuck catching a full-power kick, sweeping his partner's base leg, and stopping a finishing strike an inch from his partner's throat. The control was absolute. The speed was exceptional. The technical sophistication was undeniable. The audience erupted, and this time the applause held a different quality. Not just appreciation, but awe. Bruce stood in the wings, his mind racing, his certainty crumbling. He'd been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. He'd judged Chuck's teaching demeanor and assumed it reflected his fighting ability. He'd mistaken humility for weakness, restraint for limitation. The man who'd smiled and made jokes with students was the same man who'd just displayed mastery that matched or exceeded Bruce's own. How had he missed this? After the demonstrations, Bruce approached Chuck backstage. The words came harder than any punch Bruce had ever thrown. That was remarkable. I don't think I fully appreciated your abilities before. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest thing Bruce's pride would allow in that moment. Chuck smiled, that same genuine warmth, without a trace of vindication or smugness. Thank you, Bruce. Your demonstration was inspiring. I've been studying your work on adaptability and trying to integrate those principles into my own training. You've pushed all of us to think differently. He said it like Bruce had done him a favor, like he wasn't aware that Bruce had underestimated him for months. That generosity stung more than anger would have. Bruce had doubted Chuck, had questioned others, had privately dismissed his abilities, and Chuck's response was gratitude and respect. It was a lesson Bruce hadn't expected to learn, one that cut deeper than any physical defeat. Over the following weeks, Bruce couldn't stop thinking about that demonstration. He replayed it in his mind, analyzing every technique, every transition, recognizing sophistication he'd been blind to. His pride fought against the realization, but his commitment to truth won. He'd been wrong, because he'd assumed his way of judging fighters was infallible. He'd looked at Chuck's exterior and thought he saw everything, never considering that the greatest strength might be the kind that doesn't advertise itself. Bruce reached out to Chuck and suggested they train together seriously, not as teacher and student, but as peers. Chuck accepted immediately, enthusiastically. Their training sessions became legendary. Two masters pushing each other, sharing techniques, exploring the boundaries of what human beings could achieve in combat. Bruce learned that Chuck's humility wasn't weakness, but security. When you knew what you could do, you didn't need to prove it every moment. You could be gentle with beginners and devastating with experts, and the contrast didn't diminish you. It completed you. They became close friends. Chuck taught Bruce about the value of traditional forms when properly understood, how they contained principles that took years to extract. Bruce taught Chuck about efficiency and directness, about eliminating the unnecessary. But more than techniques, they taught each other about character. Bruce learned that strength could wear a gentle face. Chuck learned that challenging tradition could deepen rather than destroy it. One evening, after particularly intense training, they sat exhausted and dripping sweat, sharing water and conversation. Bruce said something he rarely said to anyone. I judged you incorrectly at first. I saw your kindness with students and your respect for tradition, and I thought it meant you'd stopped evolving. I was wrong. Chuck considered this, not rushing to absolve Bruce of his mistake. It's easy to confuse comfort with complacency. I understand why you saw it that way. I've never been much for advertising my abilities, but I think that was your only mistake. Everything else about your approach, your analysis, your pursuit of truth, that's all correct. You just applied it to incomplete information. The information was there, Bruce said. I just didn't look deeply enough. It was a hard admission, but Bruce had built his entire philosophy on facing hard truths. I thought I understood what strength looked like. Turns out I was still learning. Their friendship continued for years. Two legends who found in each other what so few fighters ever find, a true peer. They pushed each other technically and philosophically, appeared together in demonstrations, and slowly changed the martial arts world's understanding of what was possible. Bruce's movies would eventually make him immortal in popular culture. Chuck's films would do the same. But between them, away from cameras and crowds, they maintained something more valuable than fame. Mutual respect earned through honest challenge and genuine growth. Bruce never forgot the lesson Chuck taught him. In later years, when young fighters approached with excessive confidence, Bruce would think of Chuck and look deeper. He learned to distinguish between quiet strength and actual weakness, between humility and limitation. Some of his greatest students were the ones he almost dismissed initially, the ones who didn't look like champions but possessed the characteristics that mattered most: dedication, intelligence, and the security to learn without ego. The story of Bruce doubting Chuck never became public legend the way their friendship did. But those who trained closely with Bruce noticed something shift in him after that demonstration. He became slightly less certain in his initial judgments, slightly more willing to be surprised. The greatest martial artists of his generation had learned that even masters have blind spots, and the willingness to see those blind spots is what separates good fighters from great ones. Chuck, for his part, never held the initial doubt against Bruce. He understood that judgment based on incomplete observation was human nature. What mattered was Bruce's willingness to adjust when presented with new evidence. That intellectual honesty, that commitment to truth over ego, was what Chuck respected most about Bruce. It's what made their eventual partnership so powerful. Neither man was interested in being right. Both were interested in finding truth. Years later, when Bruce reflected on the fighters who'd most influenced his development, Chuck's name appeared near the top. Not because Chuck taught Bruce specific techniques, though he did. Not because Chuck beat Bruce in any dramatic showdown, because that never happened. Chuck influenced Bruce by being exactly who he was, a master so secure in his abilities that he could afford to be humble, so strong that he could afford to be gentle, so dedicated that he didn't need to prove it constantly. The martial arts world loves stories of dramatic confrontations, of pride defeated and ego shattered. But sometimes the most important lessons come quieter. Sometimes growth happens not through defeat, but through recognition. Bruce's greatest victory wasn't over any opponent. It was over his own assumptions, his own certainty that he could judge a book by its cover. Chuck's greatest victory wasn't in any tournament. It was in maintaining his character despite having every reason to become arrogant. In the end, what Bruce learned from Chuck shaped everything that came after. When Bruce trained his most famous students, he passed on not just technique, but wisdom. He taught them to look deeper, to judge carefully, to recognize that strength wears many faces. He taught them that the fighter who needs to prove himself constantly might be less secure than the one who proves himself only when necessary. He taught them that tradition and innovation weren't enemies, and that humility wasn't weakness, but the foundation of continuous growth. There are moments in every master's journey when they stop being a student and think they've learned everything. And there are rarer moments when they realize the learning never stops, that every person you meet might teach you something if you're willing to see it. Bruce Lee had that rarer moment watching Chucknorris demonstrate, watching his assumptions crumble, watching real strength reveal itself. The greatest fighters aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who recognize their mistakes and grow from them. Bruce Lee was great not because he was always right, but because when he was wrong, he had the courage to admit it and the wisdom to learn from it. Chuck Norris was great not because he needed everyone to know his strength, but because his strength was so complete he could afford to be kind. Legends aren't born. They're built through thousands of small choices, moments of character that compound over years. Bruce chose to look deeper. Chuck chose to stay humble. And the friendship that grew from those choices influenced martial arts more than any single technique ever could. They prove that collaboration between masters creates something greater than competition, that learning from each other elevates everyone, that the ego is the only real opponent worth defeating. The lesson echoes through every dojo and gym where serious martial artists train. Look deeper, judge slower, recognize that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who don't need to tell you they're dangerous. Understand that real strength whispers while false strength shouts. Know that the fighter sitting quietly in the corner, smiling and helping beginners, might be the one who could humble you fastest if circumstances required it. Never confuse presentation with substance, appearance with reality, comfort with complacency. Bruce Lee learned this from Chuck Norris in 1968. He carried that lesson for the rest of his too short life. And through his teaching in films, through the philosophy he shared and the students he influenced, that lesson continues to spread. The quiet ones might surprise you. The humble ones might be the strongest. And the greatest victory is always over your own assumptions, your own pride, your own certainty that you've already figured everything out. In a world that constantly confuses volume with value, gentleness with weakness, and tradition with stagnation, we need this lesson more than ever. Real strength doesn't advertise. Real mastery doesn't need constant validation. Real wisdom knows there's always more to learn, always another layer to discover, always a reason to look deeper before making judgments. Bruce Lee was brilliant enough to learn this. We should all be humble enough to remember it. The fighters who have nothing to prove are often the ones with everything to show.